Ukraine is not in an enviable situation today for a variety of reasons. Not only is Putin and Russia itself in a very aggressive position vis-à-vis Ukraine, we have to remember that it's not just Putin. If Putin was tomorrow to die in a car accident, Russian policy towards Ukraine would not change. In fact, even Russian so-called Democrats have a blind spot when it comes to Ukraine. Majority of Russians believe that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and therefore they should be living together in either close proximity or in one union state. All Russian political parties, Democrat and opposition, support the Russian annexation of the Crimea. There is some disputes between the opposition and the pro-Putin camp over Donbas, over Eastern Ukraine, but on the whole, we shouldn't expect really much difference if there's a so-called opposition were to come to power. I don't think that's going to happen in Russia, or if Putin's replaced by somebody else. The position of Russia is going to basically stay the same. We also have a situation where Ukraine, because of Russia's aggression, has the highest ever public support for joining NATO and the European Union today. It's never had such high support for that, at a time when both NATO and the European Union don't want to take in Ukraine. And that position also is not going to change much in the next 10 years or so. NATO, for obvious reasons, is that it's embattled at the moment in a kind of a new semi-Cold War with Russia. And how that's going to pan out, nobody knows. And secondly, in the case of the European Union, well, the European Union's in crisis. We all know that. You know, Britain's voted to leave. There is a growth of far-right populist, nationalist, neo-Nazi parties throughout Europe, which are opposed to the EU. And the EU itself is dealing with kind of financial crisis issues, such as in Greece. So the EU is not really likely to support enlargement. So the only thing that's really on offer for Ukraine is enhanced cooperation with NATO, particularly with key NATO members like the US, Canada, Britain, and Poland, and integration with the EU without the offer of membership. So Ukraine has to, in that sense, fend for itself. At the same time, the so-called Minsk Accords, the last ones were signed in February 2015, are obviously not working. Not a single point of the Minsk Accords have actually been implemented. And one wonders whether Putin and Poroshenko ever even believed they would implement these accords. If you talk to Ukrainian diplomats in Kiev, they will tell you that that this document that was signed in Minsk has a kind of a very strange position. It's not really a legal document. It's not a binding document because it was never put to the Ukrainian parliament for a vote. So it's not a legally binding international document that Ukraine has to implement. So it has very kind of strange circumstances. But the main stumbling block is, and why neither side have implemented anything in the Accords, is that Russia, of course, is demanding that Ukraine first hold or permit the holding of local elections in the separatist enclaves. But these would be local elections along the lines of, you know, where there would be exclusion of the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitors, exclusion of Ukrainian political parties. So it would be just freezing the current political situation where the separatists are in charge. So Putin's demanding that, and he's also demanding that Ukraine change the constitution to adopt something called a special status for the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The West, on the whole, particularly Canada and the US, and Ukrainian President Poroshenko is saying the opposite. He's saying that first we have to deal with security issues. You have to create the right environment first to move forward on political progress. So first things that have to be done are demilitarization of the separatists, withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. I mean, in the Minsk Accords they're described as foreign forces, not Russian, but the only foreign forces there are Russian. And Ukraine, again, having control over its border with Russia. So that would prevent Russia supplying the separatists and allowing mercenaries and nationalists to come into Ukraine. So once that security environment is dealt with, then you can move to the political stages, which would be the holding of proper elections under OSCE observation with Ukrainian political parties as well, and maybe then a vote for some kind of status for that part of Ukraine. Now, of course, the most contentious issue is the question of some kind of special status, because this would be strongly opposed by Ukrainian nationalists and by Ukrainian soldiers and veterans. So Poroshenko has to tread carefully there. It's also something that you have to change the Ukrainian constitution, which requires 300 votes, and that wouldn't be that easy to do in the Ukrainian parliament. So the Minsk Accords are basically stalled. They're not moving ahead at all. It's a fiction, really, that the West is saying, you know, we're waiting for the Minsk Accords to be implemented and we're hoping this is going to happen, when in reality they're not going to be implemented, and in reality this is not an anti-terrorist operation as it's officially called, it's actually a war with Russia. Let's be quite frank. Majority of Ukrainians, 70% plus, believe that Ukraine is at war with Russia. So with the continuation of the illusions of Minsk, we're actually working into this kind of fake idea that somehow there's a potential for peace accords. Now, the alternative to this would be what Yulia Tymoshenko's party Batьківщина and Mayor Sadovyi of Lviv's party Samopomich argue. They both argue that we should scrap the Minsk Accords, that Ukraine should say they're not working, they're not going to be implemented by Russia ever, which I think is true. And instead, we should declare the DNR and LNR, those two separate enclaves, declare them to be temporarily occupied Russian territory. And that way you send a signal that part of Ukraine is under Russian occupation and that Ukraine is at war with Russia. We're no longer pretending that this is some kind of, you know, anti-terrorist operation, that this is some kind of, you know, fake incursion. It's not really Russians, it's a so-called civil war. And that would be, I think, the best step to go ahead. And then once you've done that, you fortify the existing de facto border between Ukrainian-controlled Donbas and the separatist enclaves. If Trump wins, and I don't think he will, the US presidential elections, you could ask him how he would build a wall and get the Russians to pay for it. But you would be basically talking about the reality on the ground and not pretending it's otherwise. And the reality on the ground is that these territories are under Russian occupation in the same manner as the Crimea. And then the West has to deal with that situation. If you do that, then the president has a number of choices. He can basically cut off or amputate, or however you want to call it, that region and say, and Ukraine can turn its back on it, saying we can't do anything about this, this is under Russian occupation, and carry on integrating with Europe. Poroshenko could hold a referendum on what would be the future for those territories. Do we say they should be allowed to join Russia, or do we say that we should give them some kind of autonomy inside Ukraine? But more importantly, if you scrap the Minsk Accords because everybody understands they're not working. Everybody. Privately, they will tell you that. And you declare these territories Russian-occupied zones, then possibly the military situation on the ground will change to Ukraine's advantage. If, as I think, Hillary Clinton will win the US presidential elections, then it's very likely she will then no longer veto, as Obama has done, both houses of the US Congress and both US political parties veto their support for giving Ukraine so-called non-lethal weapons. And if that happens, if that floodgate opens, then I believe other countries such as Canada, Britain, Poland will also then be emboldened to do the same. Particularly at a time now where many countries are highly frustrated with Putin over its war crimes and its bombing campaigns in Syria. And they're wondering what should be the next steps that the West should do there. No-fly zone, which Hillary Clinton supports, and Boris Johnson, the Foreign Minister of Britain, both support. So we need to prepare, shall we say, Ukraine needs to look to a post-Minsk situation for those separatist enclaves. And I believe that the position, therefore, of Batьківщина and Samopomich is more realistic. It's more in tune with reality, that, in effect, parts of eastern Ukraine, parts of the Donbas, about a third of Luhansk and half of Donetsk Oblast, are in effect under Russian occupation. And we should treat them in the same manner, therefore, as we treat the Crimea, which is also under Russian occupation. And stop pretending that Russia is going to ever implement the Minsk Accords. Russia's never going to do that, because Russia's objective is the Bosnianization. Russia calls it federalization, but it's basically Bosnianization of Ukraine, making Ukraine into an ungovernable entity, which then can be controlled by Russia through those separatist enclaves, where the separatist enclaves have veto power over Kiev's domestic and foreign policy. No government or president in Kiev, including Poroshenko, will ever agree to that. So let's stop pretending that the Minsk Accords will be implemented. It's time to say the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground is that Russia is occupying parts of eastern Ukraine, and we have to therefore deal with that reality in whatever way we want to, either by ignoring those separatist enclaves and building a democratic European Ukraine with our backs to it, or with building up our military potential with a view down the road that maybe we'll take those territories back if we have strong backing from the West. But at the moment where really Ukraine is really helping the West in this pretense, in this falsity of pretending that there's a peace process in place and that Putin, and it was always amusing to have the Russian aggressor state as part of the peace process, ever likely to implement it. The Minsk Accords will never be implemented, therefore we have to deal with the post-Minsk environment. Thank you.